Well, hi, everyone. I'm Jay Nachlis. I'm a vice president and consultant at Coleman Insights, and I'm so happy you've spent some time in your calendar here to join me today for this Listener Truth Project webinar. Before we get started on this, let me give you a quick heads up about how this all came about. Many of you are familiar with Morning Show Boot Camp conference that just took place a few weeks ago. Don Anthony is the one who started that, and he and I had some conversations about, wouldn't it be interesting to do a research study about radio in 2026 and what listeners think of it, not just morning show. And when it comes to attendees at that conference, it's not just morning show talent, right? It's talent from other day parts, many formats, people from the industry, program directors. And so we talked about doing this study, but the twist was that attendees were able to ask the questions. So the questions you're going to see asked today, many of them or most of them came from attendees at the Morning Show Boot Camp conference. One other piece of getting in the weeds for a second before we get started is the methodology that we're using here. What you're going to see are one-on-one interviews, and this is a type of qualitative research. So lower sample size as opposed to quantitative research. Quantitative research we often refer to as the what of research, and qualitative is the why. So if we were doing a research project for a radio station, for example, and it was a quantitative study, you might say, what is your favorite type of music? And qualitative would say, well, why is that your favorite type of music? Quantitative would say, who is your favorite morning show host? Qualitative would say, well, why are they your favorite morning show host? And I give you this type of context because this is only 10 people we're talking to. And that doesn't mean that it's not important. And you're going to see some really common themes go through here today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything I'm going to show you in all these findings necessarily would scale if we did this among hundreds or even thousands of people. So we don't overreact to the results in that way. What do I hope you'll get from takeaways? Well, number one, I do hope you'll be inspired by these radio listeners. I hope that you'll use some outside thinking. And here's what I mean by outside thinking for those of you that haven't heard us talk about that at Coleman. Outside thinking, of course, is the opposite of inside thinking. And inside thinking is a trap that we all get into with our brands, right? When I was a program director of radio stations and I listened to my station 10 to 12 hours a day, and then I would meet a listener at an event or a remote or something like that, and I'd ask them questions about the radio station that they wouldn't be able to answer. Say, well, why weren't they able to answer them? Because they don't listen to the radio station like you do. You're so close to the product. Outside thinking is thinking in the mind of the consumer, right? You're looking at it from their lens and recognizing they don't have the time with the product that you do. And so we look at it in a different way. And from that standpoint, excuse me, while I take a drink of water. And also from that standpoint, you're going to hear listeners talk about radio today in their own language and in their own words, which could be really valuable because it may not be the way that you talk about radio. It may not be the language that you're using. One more thing before we get started. There were no major differences by format or market, and you're going to see through lines throughout this presentation. So let's get started. First of all, some of the main topics that came up in the questions that were asked by bootcamp attendees. Certainly listening habits and how they've changed. There are lots of questions about the talent, music, topic selection, commercials, and everybody's favorite topic, AI. So I'm going to show you some of the questions, not every single one of them, but a bunch of them. You're going to see answers to all of these in the session today. And this one I loved, right? What is the number one reason you listen to FM radio? Another way to put this is, what's your why, right? To me, this is the core of everything. So we'll get at the answer to that question. If you're listening to a radio station and you hear the same artist twice in the same hour, is that okay? Are weather and traffic reports necessary anymore? I liked the negative twist of this. Are there certain topics you avoid in them? If we say or post, we have a segment coming up at a set time. Do you actually tune in? And is it important to you that all voices on FM radio are human and not AI generated? As I'm sure you do, radio listeners had some strong opinions on this particular topic. So here was the scope of the study. As I mentioned before, we talked to 10 adults. They're between the ages of 18 and 49. Half of them were on the younger end of that, and half were on the older end. They had to listen to at least one morning show on an FM music station in a typical week. This doesn't mean that they just listen to morning shows, and it doesn't mean that they only listen to the current and recurrent formats that we focused on: CHR, Hot AC, rock, alternative, country, and urban. They listen to some gold-based formats as well. And when we looked at the top 50 markets, we put quotas in place. So they're not all from New York. and they're not all from Jacksonville, Florida, for example. And here are the 10 listeners. And when it all fell naturally, they're between the ages of 24 and 46. So we're going to have a lot to talk about, of course, when it comes to challenges or negatives, another way to put it, that radio listeners have. But let's get started with the good stuff, right? Let's talk about some of the pleasures they have of listening to radio today. And the first thing I'm going to show you comes back to that original, very first question that I presented. And it's what's their why? Why do they come and listen to FM music radio stations? And you're going to hear a lot of reasons, right? There's not just one or two, but you're going to hear the first mention of what will become the common thread, the biggest through line of this study. So here are some of the reasons why listeners are listening to your radio stations today.
I don't want to be on my phone and driving and having to flip through songs, and you can only skip so much on Spotify if you don't pay for it. And I just sort of am like, whatever, I'll deal with it. And then I don't mind the radio.
Keeping in tune with my community because
Okay.
they tell sometimes they'll have news that the news station won't present, because it's not a mainstream event. So local news, things like that, I will definitely listen to the radio and continue to listen to the radio for that because I feel like I can get more in depth on that.
It just depends on how I wake up. You know what I mean? If I wake up feeling, I guess, kind of down or whatever, then I'm listening to, I guess, lift my spirits. If I wake up like in an energetic type of mood, then I'm probably listening. That's basically like a multitude of like different songs, more oldies, I guess.
It's like the most important medium that we have, at least in my opinion. That and like newspapers are like the two most important mediums that nobody uses either. That is the best way to get instant information is by radio. Like when God forbid, if all hell breaks loose and, the grid goes down or something, they'll always be able to get radio waves one way or another or, something like that.
That's Alex. And I could have talked to him all day. You'll hear more from him coming up. Spoiler alert. The through line, the number one common theme we're going to talk about today is connection. And Alex gets at that here, right? We can't forget that people rely on radio as a connection point. So Alex talks about that. You also hear convenience talked about in the first listener that talked about how easy it is to use radio. And I also want to bring you to Jesus. He was the one that talked about his mood. And it's really important because some of the questions I got, for example, were about, well, do you listen to radio for the personalities or do you listen for music? And for most of these listeners, that's not a black or white question. That is a contextual answer. So specifically, when Jesus and I talked about this, he said, when I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling down, I listen to my local contemporary Christian station to lift my spirits. When I'm feeling up, I listen to the hot AC station to keep my spirits up, right? So think about that. That's not something we can control, but it is something we can control when the listeners get there. Let's move on to the escape hatch. Now, it's not going to be surprising when I tell you that listeners talk about using radio as an escape. We know that. What I think I was surprised about in talking to these listeners is the language they used unprompted about their world and how they think about it as pertains to radio. There are strong words that you're going to hear in here that almost indicates to me an underlying emotional trauma about their lives right now and think about radio playing the role of a therapist. So this goes in the pleasures section, but in a way, it's like a pleasure that stems from pain. Take a listen.
I know for when it was like the time of elections, everybody had their point of view. And that made me also stop listening to a lot of the radio stations because I know there's one thing to update people in the media about what's going on, but there's another aspect of it when it comes to like your political views and why you personally, because I feel like that also makes it a little too personal for people like me who want to know about it, but don't want to know why you personally either hate or love them or why you voted for them. You know what I mean? Like, I just kind of feel like that's a lot sometimes. It makes people tune out because it's like, it gets a little far, it gets a little far.
Well, the other radio stations are an escape. They don't talk about politics because that can alienate viewers or listeners or whatever they're called. But NPR, I used to listen to that religiously every morning, and then I just couldn't just deal with the onslaught. And so I guess escapism is part of it. Playing trivia and listening to people talk about bad dates is escape from the horrors that exist out here.
Music soothes the mind. So I literally use it for everything. I could be folding clothes. I could be walking down the hall and I'm in the mood for some music.
I feel like I have to tell you here that not once did I ever mention the word politics, but listeners certainly did. When they think about what's going on in the world and how they're overwhelmed, listen to some of the words that they used in here: go too far, alienate, the horrors out there, onslaught. It's kind of remarkable, right? And so they're choosing FM music stations to get away from things that are making them overwhelmed. And they're saying this in language that's pretty strong. Now, I don't think that this means that we always avoid hard topics. That's not practical. But I think it does mean that we need to be strategic about how we present them. So let's go back to what I talked about with outside thinking. And let me give you a personal example here. So before the pandemic, I always went into work with Coleman Insights, and post pandemic, we've been working 100% remote. And so my personal experience is I don't have to go through a regular commute anymore. And so I don't feel that the way that others do. And the other thing is, I have Android Auto. So for me, I don't use Google Maps, or I always use Google Maps everywhere I go, become quite reliant on it. And if I want the weather, I just hit the little microphone and ask what the weather is. So if you were to ask me personally, do I think that weather and traffic are still important on FM music stations? My answer would be no, because that's my personal experience. And what I would say to that is that's why you do the research.
It actually is good because of the fact that, say, if I'm in a rush or there's, I guess, like a storm or something going on, I don't want to take a route to where I don't need to be going to. So sometimes I do like the fact that a lot of stations, they kind of intervene in both, don't go this and this way, or hey, 45 is, bumper to bumper. You know what I mean?
You can't really rely solely on our phones. And sometimes we have a lot of inaccuracy with weather. So I feel like by having that, individual that's out there particularly checking to make sure, that's better than me just being like, oh yeah, my phone says it's going to be 71 degrees today. I'm just going to go off of that. And then the next thing you know, I get caught in the rain because I just trust my phone and only my phone.
I love it. I love it. That way I don't have to look at my phone now and look for the weather because it just comes through my ear, and that's part of the convenience part about it is the way they deliver the information very quickly, clearly, concise, and well timed.
I think a lot of people, especially like me, I'm not very technologically advanced. And yeah, you can check the weather report on your phone, but some people genuinely don't know how to. Like, I have an outdated iPhone. I barely know how to work it. If I was an older person not knowing how to work their phone, then I think being able to hear it on the radio is extremely important for people who just aren't really technology interested, or people who don't like technology, like turn on the radio and tuning in the morning at like 8 a.m. and being like, and the weather today is going to be 75 degrees. I think it's a great thing to keep us like connected still.
There's that word again, connected. And you can see it, right? And if you think about the way, and most listeners said this, that weather and traffic for them is still very valuable on the radio stations. And it makes sense because they see it as a connection point. And it's also the way that we present it. When you get your weather and traffic on your phone, it's utilitarian. When you get weather and traffic on the radio station, it's experiential. You have the ability to make people feel okay about the traffic. Hey, you're going to get around this construction. You can make them feel better about the weather. Hey, the storm's going to pass in a way that the phone can't. They value this connection, and that's what they're explaining here.
It actually is good.
Next, let's take a look at content.
It actually is.
Hang on one second. There we go. Let's take a look at some morning show content and how they feel about content. What keeps them coming back? There was a lot of questions from the attendees at Morning Show Boot Camp about the type of content, games and certain bits and all this kind of thing. So we talked about that, but you're going to hear kind of a more macro view of what type of content they want. And honestly, you're going to hear some negatives in here again, kind of like you heard before, that corresponds to the escape hatch, because what they want in a way kind of corresponds to what they don't want, which I think will make sense when you hear this.
I guess you could say I'm a nosy bee. So it's like I'm really big on celebrity gossip, who's doing what, who's doing this, who's doing that. I'm not too big on the news because a lot of the times I think they're a little dramatic over what we see. And then some of the things, it puts thoughts in my head that I don't need thoughts to be put in my head. You know what I mean? All the negativity. It's not like we live in the world's, best environment.
They do make me listen, and especially trivia. I do kind of get it into it. I would never call in, but I love playing along like in the car.
I wish they talked a little bit less about politics, I'll be honest. Have you ever seen the show Curb Your Enthusiasm? I like when people talk about the everyday stuff and, like just the everyday stuff. Is it appropriate to do this? Is it appropriate to do, and just something that might be debated amongst maybe even just our like microcultures. And it's a brief debate, not too heated. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that I like. I like debates, but not too heated.
And so just a little Curb Your Enthusiasm music. You hear the talk there about the things that radio stations and their shows do every day. And debates, but not too heated. That kind of talk really aligns with why when you do a topic like which way does the roll go of toilet paper, it's always going to get great responses. Let's talk about teases. So when I talk to listeners about teases, they have a really good understanding of what that is. So in other words, if I say, hey, when a DJ says something's coming up at 7:25, or we're going to talk about this after the break, they completely get that. And here's what they say as to whether or not they stick around for them.
Like when they say, if you return back at this time, we'll give you the latest update on such and such. Say it could be something like the weather, or it could be about something that's going on locally. And I'll come back in time just to make sure, that they're doing what they said they would.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if I hear like a juicy piece of gossip, like like Bieber's going to be headlining the World Cup final, like that's let's talk about how that came about. Coming up next, that's awesome. I want to hear about that. Yeah, so I definitely pay attention to that, and I'll stick around if it's good stuff.
Anything that has to do with upcoming shows or movies that's gonna get put out soon to the theaters. Like let's say if it's a Wednesday and they're like, oh, this Friday, this movie's gonna come out, but the show is gonna like tease like all the updates about like what's coming off the month of, or so on and so forth. I would definitely stick around for that.
Yeah, so what jocks talk about in teases definitely stick with them. Couple things to think about. One is this isn't a license to just do teases in general, right? Specifically, you heard we'll stick around if it's good. That's number one. Number two is think about teases as not just a tactical weapon, but also a branding opportunity. And here's what I mean by that. Let's go back to outside thinking again. If we are thinking that we do a tease and the listener doesn't stay around for the payoff, that it's been a failure, right? We didn't succeed because they didn't hear. Well, what if they had to get out of the car? What if they were going into a meeting? What if they had to take a call, right? There's all these things that are out of our control that might affect their ability to hear the payoff of the tease. And so it ends up being a disappointment. If we think of it more as a branding opportunity, a strategic branding opportunity to make sure that we're using those teases to sell and promote the things that are most important to our show and building our brand, then there's less chance of being disappointed, but also pretty good chance that they'll stick around if they can. All right. So you got to hear a lot of the good stuff. Now we're going to hear some of the big challenges. When I asked the question about, okay, which negative came up with all 10 people, what was the negative? It's not commercials, actually. Let's see what it is.
Oh my goodness. Twice in the same hour. If it's different songs, I can handle it. When it's like the same song, like when a song first drops and it becomes popular and it gets spammed over and over and over again. My goodness. That's when I really like turn completely away from that channel, that station completely for the day.
If you only listen to one radio station, you're going to hear the same six songs in the 30 minutes. I don't like Somber, and if I have to hear him one more time, I'm so over it. As soon as that song comes on, I'm going to flip around and find another station that's playing a song.
Sometimes a song is dead for me, and they'll play it over and over again on the radio still.
We don't get the full range of music, especially with there being so many genres out there. So I feel like on the radio, honestly, I feel like it's probably like 5 to 6 songs that I hear all the time. And after a while, you don't want to hear it anymore. So you kind of just turn it off.
So repetition comes up a lot. And as with everything, though, I'm going to add some context. First of all, listeners have been complaining about repetition on radio stations for a very long time. It's not a new thing. Secondly, a lot of very successful radio stations have repetition images. That said, we need to be aware of this. And I'm going to throw a couple hypotheses at you. One, do I think it's possible this is getting magnified because of streaming and the fact that listeners can listen to whatever they want and have that choice? Yeah. But do I think it's also possible that, we've been in, as Guy Zapolnia would say, the doldrums music cycle for years now? Listeners have a tendency to give repetition images, not just on songs played over and over again, but songs that they're not as excited about over and over again. So there could be some of that as well. The other thing to consider is that radio stations are not remembered by listeners as just what they do, but also how you say it, what you take credit for, verbal images. And so just consider that there are ways to mitigate the repetition image, right? It's why so many radio stations go after the very powerful variety image. But do note that this is something on listeners' minds. But wait, 24-year-old Carolyn has something to say.
I think I would miss the nostalgicness of it. Like with Spotify and all that, you can find like songs you used to listen to, but I think with the radio, it's a lot more random. And so you just kind of like, you'll hear a song pop up and be like, oh my God, I haven't heard this song in forever. And I think I would really miss that like kind of feeling, or just like that feeling of like driving home, you're listening to the radio and you're like, oh, this is really comforting and nice. Like, I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but like long road trips or like driving back from like a road trip or anything with my family, like listening to the radio, it was always like so nice to hear the radio.
I think Carolyn mentions two things that are really important here. The first is she talks about this idea that Spotify or streaming platforms are actually not very random at all, right? They learn what you like and then they essentially serve you the same thing. When she listens to the radio, she gets real randomness, real curated variety, and she likes that. She's 24. And the other thing she mentions is nostalgia. She has Gen X parents, right? She grew up with parents that listen to the radio. And so for her, the radio experience is something that brings great memories to her. And this was something that a couple of our other Gen Z listeners mentioned as well. So commercials, not surprisingly, also come up as a negative, but maybe not as widespread as you might think. Take a listen.
Local radio tend to have a lot more ads going, and then sometimes I feel like it's on repeat. So then I do switch over to podcasting. On my way to work this morning, I was listening to it. And then I zoned out like right after they finished because it was just a bunch of advertisements and then it was a bunch of like old songs that were repetitive on the radio. So that's when I really like just tuned out completely.
I kind of like them. At least it makes me feel like I'm in the present. It's the same way with like watching TV. I think they're important. Like as like societally, as weird as it sounds, because everyone claims to hate them. It makes you feel more in the present than anything else. Is the ads that are going at the time.
I'd like commercials on the radio because they're always different, and I think they have to go a little bit further to get the attention of listeners. I enjoy them. I wish some of the commercials that came on got some more help from maybe the the radio channel because sometimes they're really not produced well. But no, commercials are fine. I don't like too many all at once.
I love Nick's language, right? I just wish the commercials got a little help from the radio channel because some of them just aren't that good. So this is important how they talk about commercials, right? It's not just we don't like commercials. We don't like bad commercials, and we don't like it when you play too many commercials in a row. That's the issue. And actually, when Alex and Nick, for example, talk positively about commercials, they're coming back to that theme again. They're coming back to connection, right? It keeps me connected to my community. It keeps me connected to businesses or products that I might not have known about. So there is a real value, but we got to also understand the negative perceptions. All right, so we had a few Gen Z listeners in here. You've heard from Carolyn. You're going to hear from her again here. You're also going to hear from Tyrese, who is going to start by talking about some of the challenges he thinks that his friends have in listening to radio. A tough one to overcome. And then Carolyn is going to give you an idea she has about how to reach more Gen Z listeners.
At least in my peers, a lot of people don't listen to the mainstream media. They're listening to the underground, not the underground, but the music that might not always be for the radio. So like, and the radio can't play that. So it's not, I think it's just a disconnect between the age groups and like mainstream media.
Maybe like doing something for like a younger generation. I feel like a lot of the talk shows and everything are geared towards more like the older population. And I feel like it is because they are the people who are listening to the radio. But I think if they had something that like was geared towards the younger generation.
Yeah. So, what Tyrese is talking about is this idea that this is streaming specifically. There are so many niches, right? There are so many genres available, and radio has to appeal to a larger group of people, right? So this makes some sense. And then Carolyn is really specifically talking about content. Do we have enough content that's relevant rather, to Gen Z listeners? So I have a 20-year-old son, and years ago he introduced me to some of the videos on Mr. Beast, and I remember the very first thing I said to him was, "These are radio stunts that he's doing." And what you're going to hear Alex talk about when it relates to contesting is this idea that contesting as a utilitarian method, they're not that interested in, but experiential, they're very interested. Take a listen.
I remember like back in the day, like they used to do all these types of insanity events and stuff. Like how long could you hold your hand on a car? Like, and like that kind of thing. And milk chugging contests, which you can't do because you know for a fact that your body can't handle it, but people did it. I think those kind of things, like, it brought community, it did a lot of good stuff. I wish there were more of those like in person real events, not like phone calls and like raffles and all that crap, because the raffle thing is BS. Like any of that stuff, like everyone feels like it's fixed. But I mean, if you saw somebody put their hand on a car for like a day and a half, like then for a fact that dude won the car.
And what's amazing about that is Alex is talking about this contest that happened years and years and years ago, and he still remembers it, right? Because it's not rigged, it's not fixed. Someone had their hand on the car. And this goes back to this idea about radio's purpose of connection, right? And it's, again, experiential versus tactical or utilitarian. And finally, AI. How do you feel about this idea of a radio station using AI DJs versus human DJs? Here's what they say.
I'm always going to be an advocate for the humans over the AI bots. I'm not going to say that I'm not fond of AI because I feel like it can be helpful to an extent, but I feel like the overuse of it and the false advertising and marketing that they're using for it now is bringing the real detrimental bad results of AI. So yeah, that's my take on that.
I just don't want to listen to a robot. I feel like I just that is a terrible choice. We're putting people out of work and we're ruining the earth by using AI. So what do I know?
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm going to dig that. I haven't identified any AI DJs yet, or like I haven't heard it and been like, oh, that's an AI DJ. No, I haven't come across that, and I don't think I would dig it just because I value the kind of the spontaneity of it all. I like to hear a little cough in the background. I like to hear that it's being done live and by people, and that things can change at any moment. I'm not so sure the AI DJs can pull that off.
I think it's a bubble that is about to absolutely destroy billions, if not trillions of dollars. And I think every person that's running an AI company that at least we know of is a completely batshit and should not have this kind of money human being. And the fact that we're egging them on and letting them use these products that we know are made by shitty people is not good. And it's gonna bite us in the ass. So I don't
Personally cannot stand AI. I think that, especially something as classic as a radio, that's like, I think it should continue to be human. Like the DJs, like it's been such a interesting niche, like career for a lot of people for a long time. I work as a radio host, or I work as a radio DJ, and for that to be replaced with it's just very disheartening to hear. Yeah. It just like I feel like if they replace like the people with AI, then at that point it's a streaming service.
Yeah, and I think, again, this goes through the whole connection of everything that we've talked about. This connection through line. You hear it in the service elements. You hear it with the hand on the car. You hear Nick talking about it. It kind of reminds me about, in voice tracking. Do you leave the cough in? He says, I just like to hear the cough. Human connection is the through line, and if it's not available to them, it's really against the brand promise that they expect. So here are some of the findings. First of all, as you heard kind of in the beginning, is the what's your why. Radio is easy to use. And I think you heard throughout this that it's important to remember that maybe not every listener is as technologically advanced as we think they are. They might have old phones. They might not be connected in the cars as well as they would like to be. And radio provides that easy through line. Mood is very important. We got to remember that it's very contextual, the way that listeners listen. So they may come to you when they're down or they come to you when they're up, but how we serve them when they get there is very important. And then connection, the through line throughout this entire presentation. We got to remember that we're the escape hatch from stress. Listeners are using language that's very emotional, very overwhelmed. And so we're providing this service to them where they can just escape from the real world, even if just for a little bit, with the music and the content that we provide them. And speaking of that content, you know what? They love this content. And so, we can get granular about the types of bits that we do. And they mentioned all this type of stuff. But ultimately, the things that most of us do every day, story-driven content, stories about bad dates, prank calls, trivia, where they can play in the car even if they don't call in, everyday life, artist interviews that are relevant. For the most part, they love all of it if it's done well because it aligns with the idea of the escape hatch. It gets them out of the real world and into this world that they can just decompress for a little bit. Service elements still matter for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I just said a few minutes ago, the technological issue, but also connection and how you present it is really important. But most listeners that we talk to still value weather and traffic from FM radio stations. The repetition frustration is universal. It was mentioned by all 10 of them, but keep in mind not to get, too overthinking about this. It's been a concern for a long time, and we can mitigate it by some of the verbal usage that we have on the radio station. Commercials are not their favorite thing in the world, but let's focus on the things we can control. They are paying attention to the quality of your commercials, and they're paying attention to how many spots you're playing in a row. Teases work. Even if you don't get the payoff in that moment, teases work as a branding opportunity. They remember things about your show and they're helping you brand your show. So use them effectively, and make them great. Be experiential, not transactional. This was really well verbalized, I think, by Alex when he talked about the hand on the car, but it's also through all of it. It's the way you present weather and traffic. It's the way that you present contesting. It's the way that you tell a story. Be experiential, not transactional, which flows pretty well right into the final thing, which is be human. We see how much they value human connection. They value it deeply. And if we're not providing that connection, again, it's breaking the brand promise of why they're coming to FM music radio stations in the first place. If you've got your phone and you want to take a picture of this, that'll lead you right to the Tuesdays with Coleman blog page. This is our blog that comes out every other Tuesday. We put out regular content on there. And when you get to that page, if you're not a subscriber yet, you should see a little pop-up that allows you to subscribe. I want to thank everybody for attending the Listener Truth Project webinar today. Bye-bye.